In wrestling, as with any other medium, true trendsetters and mold breakers don't come along that often, and when they do, they don't always get the respect they deserve at that specific point in time. These creative thinkers often had to wait years to become as loved and respected as they deserved. It's a shame, but a path shared by many of the sport's great innovators, all of whom were responsible for pushing the game forward. Missing from our list are honourable mentions like Mick Foley, superstar Billy Graham, Bruiser Brody and Rob Van Dam. But with all that out of the way, I'm Andy for WhatCulture Wrestling, and here are 10 wrestlers who are way ahead of their time. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to stay notified. Ding, ding, done. Number 10. Taz. Taz wasn't mainstream wrestling's first submissionist, but he might have been the first to incorporate the MMA feel pervading the sport at every level in 2018. He brought a real fight feeling missing in wrestling up to that point, and did so by fighting with a real dangerous edge and an air of legitimacy that made him downright fearsome despite his diminutive stature. On top of this, he also popularised getting opponents to tap out for a submission, as until he came along most submissions were done via arm dropping or vocal submission. Now, tap-outs are everywhere, and the Taz mission is a huge part of that. Number 9. Nick Bockwinkel. Now here's a name that doesn't get brought up often enough when discussing the greatest talkers in wrestling history, but it should. Bockwinkel's delivery was calm, calculated and charismatic. He was the antithesis of Ric Flair in that regard, using sharp, articulate language to dissect his opponent and the crowd, stirring their vitriol without getting too carried away and shouting all over the place. This delivery has been aped by many a wrestler over the years, including Chris Jericho in his suit-clad late 2000s run. Bockwinkel eschewed sweaty anger for brutal intellect, setting him aside as the original cerebral assassin. Number 8. Raven. More philosophical than threatening, Raven was another one who soared on the strength of his promos, seemingly going off on tangents before returning to a cohesive point, and always ending with, quote the Raven, nevermore. He looked like a mad grunge goober, taking advantage of a subculture weirdly underrepresented in wrestling, and this only added to his awesome aesthetic. Raven was misanthropic before misanthropy was cool, a dark soul and a leader of the lost. CM Punk called himself the voice of the voiceless in 2011, but his old Ring of Honor rival Raven was leading abandoned souls into combat 2 decades prior. Number 7. Bad News Brown. Neither bad nor good, Bad News Brown's alignment was somewhere between the two. He was aligned to nobody but himself, and for some generations, that made him wrestling's first ever tweener. A no-nonsense bad lad with black tights and a simple motto, DTA, don't trust anyone, he could be considered a Stone Cold Steve Austin prototype in many ways. He was also the first to properly terrorise an authority figure, famously roughing Jack Tunney up on the Brother Love show. It was truly shocking at the time, and a variation on this Rebel vs. Boss story would eventually help WWE put WCW out of business 10 years later. Such was the transformative effect of Bad News Brown on Austin vs. McMahon. Number 6. Sabu. This mad didn't invent high-flying or hardcore wrestling, but he was the first to truly merge the two, launching himself off all manner of tables and chairs in the name of insanity. Without him, it's unlikely that your Jeff Hardys would have gained such prominence, such as Sabu's influence. Sabu could also be considered the indie wrestling scene's first true star. He was independent wrestling's best-kept secret, and oft whispered about star of traded tapes and match recommendations, making a name for himself out with the sport's top 2 companies. Number 5. Goldust. Arriving in WWE in 1995, Goldust took Mind Games to a whole new level with his uniquely eccentric gimmick unlike anything else in the company's macho world. He was unafraid of finding new ways to get under the skin of his opponents and the audience, speaking to the general fear of anything sexually ambiguous, and while the Bizarre One wasn't the first to exploit this, he was the first to turn it up to 100. The games Goldust played were as mental as they were physical, but you could argue that the biggest game was played on Dustin Runnels himself, a man seemingly trapped by the gimmick forever, destined to drown in latex and face paint. Number 4. Gorgeous George. Look, when Bob Dylan, James Brown and Muhammad Ali cite you as an influence, you've got to be pretty far ahead of your time. Gorgeous George is widely regarded as the first sports entertainment. He recognised the potential TV had to change the game, and as such, created an over-the-top character tailor-made for the new format. He was one of, if not the first, to make his way out to the ring to entrance music with a valet and a personal butler. Rings would be sprayed clean before he entered, and crowds bayed for his blood, with thousands parting with their cash in the hope that someone would shut him up. Gorgeous George was the first true superstar of TV wrestling, and his influence spread beyond the game itself and into entertainment. Number 3. Dynamite Kid. Tom Billington might be the most influential wrestler of the modern era. At 5'8", he completely changed the perception of smaller competitors. He was as mean and intense as they come, and boasted a crisp, offensive style generally regarded as the first true fusion of the American, Japanese, and Mexican styles. But the problem here is that Dynamite's wrestling style hasn't led to many happy endings. The man destroyed himself with his own techniques, and Chris Benoit, unfortunately, was his most famous disciple. Daniel Bryan too is another who took huge inspiration from Billington, but he eventually returned from his own concussive nightmare. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the now paralysed innovator. Number 2. Jake the Snake Roberts. Go back and watch any WWE pay-per-view from the late 80s or early 90s. Skip the matches for now and check out the promos. You'll get a conveyor belt of shouty a void of subtlety and a lot of spit and sweat, apart from one man. Jake Roberts stood out. When he spoke, his slow, deliberate cadence left audiences in a cold sweat, not the camera lens covered in spittle. He used psychological intimidation to get to his opponent, and his words carried a genuine threat that negated exaggeration of cartoon violence. Quoting philosophers, psychologists, and artists, his whisper was more terrifying than the roar of others. Number 1. Brian Pillman. In terms of blurring the lines of kayfabe and reality, Pillman was a pioneer, with Arn Anderson describing him as either the craziest smart man I have ever met, or the smartest crazy man, and it's difficult to disagree. Whether it was his infamous feud with Kevin Sullivan that led to the I respect you Booker man in the middle of the ring, his threat to piss in the ring itself on ECW, or even brandishing a gun on Monday Night Raw, Pillman had no respect for the fantasy/reality seesaw whatsoever. Pillman set the tone for the Attitude Era more than any other, a character that smudged the lines between fact and fiction and established the anything that can happen atmosphere that managed to make professional wrestling so cool in the late 1990s. It's just a tragedy that he wasn't around to see it.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe below, and if you're looking for more content like this, then try a few things that are floating about around my ears. It might be fun. I can't promise it though, but it might be.